Thank you, Pedro. It's good to be here in Lisbon again, this time, sadly, for a bittersweet celebration of the life of Stephan Guyenet. Stephan was a kind and generous person and someone who was intensely motivated to understand the fundamental drivers of modern non-communicable diseases. And this is a photo here that Stephan sent me, one of the photos that he took while he was doing his research on Hadza, and I have a few more interspersed throughout the talk. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. First, I'm going to talk about the epidemiological transition from mortality and morbidity patterns of our ancestors to modern industrial mortality and morbidity patterns. Second, I'm going to talk about the evolutionary mismatches that I believe are driving this transition. And third, I'm going to talk about some of the mechanisms that I believe are involved. Okay, so epidemiological transition. We know from a wide variety of evidence, including the work of Stephan Guyenet, which has been very important for this, that traditionally living people are typically lean with a low risk of non-communicable disease. So I'm talking about cardiovascular disease, I'm talking about diabetes, I'm talking about certain types of cancers, a wide variety of diseases that are uncommon presumably among our distant ancestors and are much more common today. So and we have a lot more data on this than we used to. In 1971, Abdel Omran coined the term epidemiological transition, and he defined it as a long-term shift that occurs in mortality and disease patterns whereby pandemics of infection are gradually displaced by degenerative and man-made diseases as the chief form of morbidity and primary cause of death. And I've bolded this term, man-made diseases. I think this is important because there is an implicit acknowledgement, even in the mainstream biomedical community, that many of the diseases we face today are due to a change in environment away from evolutionary norms. And this idea may not be explicitly applied in mainstream biomedical research, but it is an idea that is implicitly there. And again, we have a lot more evidence than we used to on this. And today we have organizations such as the Global Burden of Disease Project that is quantifying the global shift in mortality and morbidity patterns over time as nations are industrializing. And so what I'm going to show you here are some data from the Global Burden of Disease Project. And on the vertical axis, we have a measure called DALYs, which is a measure of the total morbidity and mortality burden for different conditions. And what I'm showing here are data from middle-income countries. These are countries like Russia and China that are really rapidly transitioning from a more traditional lifestyle to a modern industrial lifestyle. And what we can see is that for things like injuries, violence, diarrheal diseases, that's a major cause of mortality in children, meningitis, another major source of mortality, these things are declining. And these are the things that our ancestors faced. These are problems that our ancestors have faced for millions of years, probably long before that. These things are all declining during the transition to industrialization. And this is a wonderful thing. We've benefited in many ways from this. At the same time, we have the rise of these new diseases, these diseases that Omran referred to as man-made diseases, such as ischemic heart disease, that's heart attacks, and diabetes, and of course, obesity. This is a graph from the United States showing that between 1960 and 2014, there was a threefold increase in the prevalence of obesity. And this is a trend that we're seeing throughout the affluent, industrialized world. So what's causing this? as I said, I think there's widespread implicit acceptance of the idea that there's some kind of change in environment that is causing this increase in non-communicable disease prevalence. And this gets back to a hypothesis that we can call evolutionary mismatch. And one definition of this was written by Daniel Lieberman, who's a professor of evolutionary biology at Harvard. And he calls this diseases that result from our Paleolithic bodies being poorly or inadequately adapted to certain modern behaviors and conditions. So essentially, there's a mismatch between the conditions that our bodies and our brains evolved to expect and the ones that they are currently experiencing, and that leads to dysfunction. And so what I'm going to argue today, and undoubtedly the mismatches that are driving non-communicable diseases are very complex. I'm certain that there are many different mismatches that are contributing to this. However, what I'm going to argue today is that there is one mismatch in particular that is very simple, very important, and I believe does not receive all the recognition that it deserves. And that is simply calorie intake. So this is a graph of calorie intake over time from my book, The Hungry Brain. And this is in the United States between 1975 and 2008. And this was assessed using 3 different methods. And I don't have time to describe exactly what those methods are, but I simply want to note that 3 independent methods suggest that in the United States over that period of time, our calorie intake increased substantially. And the most accurate of these methods suggests that every day in the United States we are eating 218 more calories, the average person that is, 218 more calories than we ate back in 1975. And judging by increased rates of overweight and obesity throughout the industrialized world, these trends are operating in many different countries, not just the United States. So obviously, the increase in body fatness is being driven by this calorie intake, but I think that the consequences extend far beyond that. And some of the research that's been done on this has associated obesity with higher prevalence or higher risk of several different non-communicable diseases. But in some data that were published relatively recently by a researcher, Andrew Stokes and his group, they have looked at this in a new way that I think gives a much clearer view of the true cost of obesity, so the true association between obesity and non-communicable disease. And what they did was they recognized that typically when you associate obesity with non-communicable disease, there are some very important confounding factors that can interfere with the true association between those two things. And one of them is that a person who is currently lean today may not have been lean 5 years ago or 10 years ago. They may be lean as a result of a disease process, such as diabetes or Alzheimer's disease, or perhaps they're smoking cigarettes, which causes weight loss. So what Andrew Stokes decided to do, he said, well, let's look at weight history. Let's say, what is a person's maximum attained weight? And let's use as our comparator group, our baseline, people who have been lean for their entire lives. Not just people who are lean now, but who have always been lean. And when you do that, a very different picture emerges. So here this is just showing that we're using as our comparator people who have never been obese. And when we compare that disease risk to people who are currently obese, what we see, something's not showing up here. Anyway, what we see is a very striking pattern for a number of non-communicable disease. We see that with diabetes, there's a very strong association, 5.6-fold the risk. A variety of types of cardiovascular disease, including heart attacks and strokes, greatly increased risk, arthritis, liver disease. So we see very strong associations between obesity and a variety of non-communicable diseases, suggesting that calorie intake may be involved. So these are observational studies, these are associations. Now I'd like to move into intervention studies, which gives us a better view of the cause and effect relationship that's operating here. So to start off, I want to start with a fun little N=1 experiment that was conducted by a man named Mark Haub. So Dr. Haub is the head of the Department of Nutrition at Kansas State University. And in 2010, he decided to conduct a very unusual experiment. For 10 weeks, he ate a diet that was composed primarily of junk food. So we're talking about Twinkies and Doritos and Oreos. He was drinking Diet Mountain Dew. I mean, horrible diet, a diet that no one in their right mind would recommend someone eat. He was eating some vegetables with dinner, as well as a protein shake and a multivitamin, but a very important detail is he was restricting his calorie intake to 1,800 calories per day or less. So after 10 weeks, what happened? Well, he lost 27 pounds, predominantly fat. His blood pressure declined. His fasting glucose declined. He had a 20% decline in his LDL or bad cholesterol, 24% in his HDL or good cholesterol, and a 39% decline in triglycerides. This is extraordinary. I mean, if he walked into his cardiologist's office or his endocrinologist, they would say, this is fantastic, you're doing a great job. And this is all on a diet that most of us, no one in their right mind, no nutrition professional would recommend a diet like this. And so the calorie intake is a very important element of this. And of course, this is an N=1 experiment. This is an anecdote. We can't draw too many conclusions from this. So let's move into real randomized controlled trials. I'm going to talk about a study here that I think is very, very important to understand for anyone who is interested in the relationship between nutrition and chronic disease risk. And this is the Diabetes Prevention Program study. So they recruited more than 3,000 pre-diabetic adults with obesity or overweight, and they divided them into a control group and an intervention group. The intervention group was instructed to lose 7% of their body weight using a low-calorie, low-fat diet and 2.5 hours per week of exercise. So what did they actually do? After 2.8 years, they had only lost about 4 kilos, which is 4% of their body weight, and only about 58% of them were actually meeting the exercise goal. So this is a really modest intervention, very modest intervention. After 2.8 years, the control group, 11% of them had progressed to diabetes, whereas in the lifestyle intervention group, only 4.8% of them had progressed to diabetes. So that's a 58% reduction in diabetes incidence due to this very, very modest intervention, restricting calorie intake and increasing physical activity. And I want to be very clear about this. This is not a biomarker study. This is actual diabetes incidence. This is the actual development, this is actual prevention of the development of a non-communicable disease from a very modest intervention that focused on energy balance. And in a follow-up study, the researchers found that weight loss was the dominant predictor of reduced diabetes incidence. For every kilo of weight loss, there was a 16% reduction in the risk of developing diabetes. That's really extraordinary. So what are the mechanisms that underlie this? I think there are multiple mechanisms, but obviously eating is a behavior. The amount of calories that we ingest is a behavior. And so there's only one organ in the body that generates behaviors, and that's the brain. And so if we want to understand why we are eating more calories than we require to maintain metabolic and cardiovascular health, we have to understand how the brain regulates calorie intake. And this is a complex topic, and I don't have time to cover it in much detail, but I'm going to try to give a very broad overview of what I believe are the evolutionary forces and how the brain has been designed by them to cause us to eat more calories than we require for optimal non-communicable disease risk. So the first point I want to make is that natural selection cares a lot about food. Animals that are more efficient at acquiring food are going to have more offspring than animals that are not very efficient at acquiring food. And because of this, natural selection selects for efficient food-seeking behavior and therefore designs brains that are really good at getting food. And efficient food-seeking follows certain consistent principles. And because it follows consistent principles, it can be mathematically modeled, and this is exactly what biologists have done in multiple species. And they've come up with this equation called the optimal foraging equation that explains a lot of foraging behavior. And this is a very simple equation. The value of a food item, and therefore whether it should be pursued in relation to other foods, is equal to the calories that food contains minus the calories it takes to acquire it divided by the amount of time that it takes to acquire it. So this is simply the calorie return rate of different food sources. So the same way that you would try to maximize your financial return rate in an investment, you try to maximize your calorie return rate if you're foraging in a natural environment. This is just very simple economic principles. So natural selection has designed brains that implement these economic principles. And so even though a lioness does not understand math, does not understand economics, she behaves as if she does, because natural selection has crafted a brain that implements these economic principles. And another thing that's very, very important about this is that it's been demonstrated that wild humans or human hunter-gatherers implement the optimal foraging equation. This has been shown in multiple hunter-gatherer cultures, but most notably the Ache of Paraguay, as studied by Kim Hill. He concluded that energetic returns from foraging strategies is probably the best single predictor of foraging patterns. And this is really amazing. I mean, human behavior is so complex, and that you could capture a large proportion of it with such a simple equation, I think is really amazing. And that underscores how important calories, how important energy is to survival and reproduction. So I want to decompose this equation into two very simple concepts. The first is the benefit of food. The benefit here is the calories primarily. Of course, there are other qualities to food, but this is an important one. And then there are the costs of food. And so the human brain is always looking for a good deal. Whether you're shopping online for something, whether you're negotiating for a job, or whether you're making decisions about food, the human brain is always looking for the most benefit for the least cost. And so what happens when the benefits of food are very, very great because food is very rich in calories and the costs are very, very low? It requires very little work or time to acquire that energy. So what happens when a hunter-gatherer is placed in a situation where the value of food, according to this equation, is very, very high? Well, I asked this question of several different anthropologists, and here's what they told me. So Kim Hill, who studies the Ache, told me in one sitting, if they're able to get it easily, an Ache will eat up to 5 pounds of meat, especially if it's fatty, 20 to 30 wild oranges that are very similar to the ones that we eat today in the grocery store, 1.5 liters of honey. Can you imagine drinking 1.5 liters of honey in one sitting? Herman Ponser, who works with the Hadza in Tanzania, told me the Hadza will sit down literally with a can full of honey and eat the whole thing. It's like taking one of those honey plastic bears. This is a container you can buy in US grocery stores. It looks like a little bear that you get in the supermarket and drinking it like a glass of milk. Brian Wood told me the Hadza fully embrace the idea of eat as much pure fat as you can possibly eat. There's no hint of moderation whatsoever in their drive and motives with eating food. And what's really interesting about this to me is, I mean, this sounds terrible, right? I mean, that it's so gluttonous, but this is good for them. This behavior helps them to thrive and survive in an environment where it's difficult to acquire calories. And so this opportunistic behavior is, I believe, deeply wired into the human brain. So what I want to argue now is that the value of food, according to this optimal foraging equation, has increased greatly in the modern world relative to the ancestral world. So the first point I want to make is that we have outsourced the time and effort cost of food to the food industries and to restaurants. So the time and effort cost of food has dramatically declined relative to our distant ancestors and even our relatively recent ancestors. So this is a graph showing the proportion of total food spending spent on food to be eaten at home versus away from home in the United States between 1889 and 2008. You can see that in 1889, 93% of our food expenditures were on food to be eaten at home. So people were going, they were buying flour, they were buying meat, they were buying vegetables, and then preparing food in the home from single ingredients. Whereas today, we spend half of our food expenditures on food to be eaten in the home and half in restaurants, including fast food. And even the food that we're eating at home often is not things we're preparing from single ingredients. We're purchasing pre-prepared food and simply eating it in the home. And so I think the trends are actually much more dramatic than what this graph shows. So we used to have eggs and toast for breakfast. Now we have Pop-Tarts. We used to make sandwiches for our kids for lunch. Now we have Lunchables. So we've really engineered the time and effort cost of food out of our environment. Also, the cost of food. This is money is an abstract representation of time and effort. In the United States, in 1930, we were spending 25% of our disposable income on food, and today it's only 10%. And this is the same in all affluent, industrialized countries. Food is a lot cheaper than it used to be. So if we go back to this optimal foraging equation, what we can see is that the benefits of food, according to this equation, have increased. We're surrounded by these very calorie-dense foods, and at the same time, the costs have dramatically decreased. The effort and the time and the financial cost of food has dramatically decreased. So according to this equation, the value of modern foods is incredible. It's an incredible deal. And the brain is always looking for a deal. The brain loves a deal. And so in the same way that very high-value foods drive the Hadza brain to overeat, it also drives the modern human brain to overeat. Because our brains may not be identical to Hadza brains, but they certainly respond similarly to economic incentives. And I believe that the economic incentives provided by the modern food environment drive us to eat too much food. So I'd like to thank Stephan Guyenet for all of his wonderful contributions to this community and for bringing us here today. I'd also like to thank Kim Hill and Herman Ponser and Brian Wood, who are the anthropologists who I interviewed. This is a photo, by the way, of Catawba that Stephan sent me as well. It's one that I really like. And if you enjoyed this talk, you can see more work by me at my website, stephanguyenet.com, or check out my book, The Hungry Brain. Thank you.